Hello, everyone. Thanks so much for joining me here today as we get to talk about one of my favorite subjects, comic books. My name is Jose. I love comic books. I love talking about them. I love sharing them with you. Feel free to follow me on social media if you would like. Links are in the description below. I've also posted a link to the Marvel fan site that'll have plot synopsis and character bios for this issue. The Uncanny X-Men number 180 from 1983 by Chris Claremont and John Romita Jr. This is the last issue before Secret Wars. I am covering Secret Wars on a separate playlist. Feel free to check that out. I have just completed issue number 6, so we're halfway there. I do have a several playlists for this. I have an X Universe playlist where I combine everything in reading order. So X Men, Uncanny X Men, eventually X Factor. Also New Mutants and Excalibur all will be there. The Wolverine limited series is in there. Marvel Fanfare is in there. So a lot of stuff in that one. If you want to hear everything from the very beginning, I started with Giant Size X Men number 1, which I read as Classic X Men 1 and continued through. I've also got just an X Men playlist, and I also have just an New Mutants playlist. So check that out here. So we got Storm and Kitty Pryde here. John Romita Jr. and Dan Green do the cover. This is the classic X Men, or the X Men classic at this time. Um, and so here we go. Whose life is it anyway? And so Charles is finally, his legs are completely healed. And here he is shooting some basketball. Bob Wycheck is still sort of around, but eventually it's just going to be Dan Green, who, by the way, Dan Green, rest in peace, brother. He passed away last year, I think. So here he is. Look at this Xavier basketball, 72 73, right? And so here he is, kind of doing his little thing, happy to be able to get his legs back. And then, of course, his head hurts because he's feeling that scan that is the Beyonder. Um, and so at the end of this issue, of course, the X-Men will head on to Battle World. So the way it's going to go is it's going to be 3 consecutive issues of the New Mutants, because there are 3 issues of the New Mutants that will take place during the week that they are in Battle World. Secret Wars, even though it's 12 issues, really took place over the space of a week. So during that time, we're gonna have 3 issues of the New Mutants that's gonna be covering um, some loose threads before we pick up on the next issue of X Men, where they return from Battle World here. So Professor, and he's like, and it is Storm here, and she's like, I heard you cry out. Are you all right? And he says, I'll live through it. I fear I'll ache in the morning. I understand how you must feel. He says, do you, Professor? You have only recently regained the use of your legs. Push yourself too hard or too quickly, and you could do yourself serious injuries. Point well taken. I did let myself get a bit carried away. In the future, I'll behave. And Storm says, it's for your own good. Professor, were you an athlete? And he says, in college, I loved sports, but I had to give it up. I could read the opposing team's thoughts. You see, I knew their plans the moment they did and was able to counter them with ease. It was a cruel and fair advantage. It took all the joy out of a game. Under the circumstances, it would have been dishonorable to keep playing, so I quit. I hated my sight talent then. I'd have given anything to be rid of it. And Storm says, when I learned I could control the weather, I thought it was so wonderful. I have no conception of the responsibility such power entailed, but soon I learned. I wish the cost had been not so dear. And he kind of holds her. I like how John Romita does things. He draws these huge hands. There's an issue of Iron Man that he did with John Byrne, and the guy's holding a phone, and it's just massive. So, anyway, Professor asks if Storm's okay. She says, "Not according to Kitty. To her, I've become a monster." And he says, "Well, you certainly changed." And he's like, and she's like, "For better or worse." Um, and Professor thinks here, "How extraordinary. I've never thought of Storm as a woman. She's always seen beyond such things. Yet looking at her now, I suddenly find myself all too aware how female and attractive she is." Oh my God, Professor. "True, you once considered yourself a goddess and acted accordingly, but there's no shame in simply being human. I never thought of Storm as a woman," he says here. What? All right, whatevs. Anyway, he's saying, "I wonder, perhaps I was better off living that lie. The difference is not cosmetic, Professor. My appearance is an expression of something deep within me, and at times this transformation frightened me as much as Kitty. I find myself casting aside the precepts and beliefs that gave my life meaning, and hardly missing them once they are gone. I nearly killed Callisto of the Morlocks when we first fought, and would have done so during our second battle had I been given the chance. I who once held all life sacred." So I do like this evolution of Storm. Of so Chris Claremont really did an awesome thing. Sometimes I think I hoped I must be insane, and so Professor mind scans her and says, "No, you're not mentally sick." So one of the things about Uncanny X-Men and Chris Claremont is how verbose he is. He's extremely verbose, but unlike Todd McFarlane, Chris Claremont's verbosity has a purpose, whereas Todd McFarlane does seem to go in the rambling. He puts in a lot of words just for the sake of putting in a lot of words to make himself look clever. I love McFarlane's art, but never his writing is not something that I truly have cared for. So, all right. Anyway, so the professor says that was merely a surface scan. However, the gross physiological anomalies, I would have to probe more deeply to learn the nature and extent of any purely emotional disorder. Even then, there is a limit to what I can or should do. It's tempting to meddle with people's minds, says the professor, but I too learned a harsh lesson that for all my care and fine intentions, the consequences can be devastating and occasionally tragic. I'll help as best as I can, Ororo. And Storm says, "No, Professor, for the present, I prefer to find my own path." And then she thinks here, "But is it to become the Wind Rider I once was, or accept what I am? Is that what I truly wish to be here?" So, elsewhere here, we're looking at playing of a video game, and look at these points up, and it's Doug Ramsey and Kitty Pryde here, who are both teenagers. Now, if you're following the New Mutants, Doug was accepted into the Massachusetts Academy, which of course is with the White Queen and the Hellfire Club here. So, all right. And so suddenly she goes, "Oh," and he goes, "What happened? I scored too many points. I must have overloaded the microchip running the game and crashed the system." And this guy's like, "That's all she wrote, kids. Take a hike." And he's like, "Why don't we do it?" He's like, "Don't give me no lip, punk, or I'll bill you folks for the game you broke." Um, and she's like, "Hey, I can fix it." And she's like, "You guys are too good," basically. And he's like, "The whole point of the arcade is so kids keep dropping quarters, not so that they can continue playing," he says. So, all right. And so they've been banned from all the arcades now. So, all right. And so at one point, I think they teased a relationship with these two, but it never really developed into anything. So, and so they're gonna talk to each other. They kind of like each other, and she mentions, and he likes her too. But then they're like, "What's wrong? Why are you so grumpy?" And she says, "It's Storm. When we first met, I thought she was the most beautiful person, inside and out, I'd ever seen. Then last spring in Japan, she cut her hair, changed her clothes, and she suddenly got harder, tougher. The gentle, the serenity was gone." And he says, "Have your feelings changed?" And Kitty says, "I don't know. In a way, I don't really care because my feelings for her have. I can't help myself. I always figured that for when you love someone, it was forever. That didn't hold for my folks, and I thought it would for me and Ororo. And Doug says, and you're not sure? How can you love someone who scares you? She says. And so Kitty continues here. She knew what she meant to me, how important she was. Why did she have to become different? It isn't right, Doug. It isn't fair, says Kitty. So she apologizes to him for bringing that up, but he feels like he's lost her. He says, "I'm a friend too, Kitty. I'll be here if you need that. If you need me, and you mean that." And so you can see them kind of holding hands here. Like I said, it was sort of teased, but nothing ever developed of this. So we get a little bit of a recap of him being accepted into the school, and he wants her to show her around. And he says, "I was only there a week, and I hated it." And he's asked how come. She guess chemistry. I guess I wasn't cut out to be a preppy. And of course, she thinks here it's because it's the Hellfire Club. And then she talks about the Hellfire Club. Like I said, I have a playlist, or feel free to go to the Marvel fan site here. So we're back at Professor X's. And here we're seeing a tree getting chopped down. Apparently, there's a lot of trees that always need to be cut down or removed at the X Mansion. But here we have a tree getting chopped, and it is Colossus who is recovering from uh, the the Brotherhood. And so, way to go, Petey! And of course, it's Wolverine here. Um, and he says it's pretty impressive how well he's doing. I love the use of screen tones here. Um, and Peter doesn't want company, and he's like, "Don't you have anywhere else to be?" And Wolverine's like, "Nope." And Colossus is like, "Pity." So, um, so of course, there's some concerns with Kitty Pride. And Colossus says, in Russia, we could be married right now, raising a family. And Wolverine's like, it's okay to wait, because in the United States, of course, uh, a relationship with a young kid is not looked upon too fondly. Um, Starting, I think, in the 60s and 70s, but before that, it was actually quite common. There's pictures of weddings with 13-year-old girls in during the 20s and 30s. So there was um, so he says, "I thought it was, and that I could. And it had never entered my head that Katya felt differently. She gave herself to the Morlocks to save your life, bub. I figured that gives you a pretty idea where she stands." And Colossus is like, "I wish I was certain." And Wolverine says, "You scared, boy?" And so, of course, they're talking about Douglas Ramsey. He's feeling very jealous of her. And so, like I mentioned before, just the soap opera that Chris Claremont had brought into the X-Men really made this thing stand out as characters. I mean, really not much has happened. All we've had so far in 11 pages has been nothing but talking, but it's gripping and really cool. Um and so um Wolverine says, "If that's what you truly believe, Peter, about yourself as well as her, you've already lost more than you know." So, all right, now we're in the Bronx here, the Botanical Gardens, and it looks like it's winter outside, but inside here is Storm. It's kept nice, and she's looking at the flowers, remembering um, being in Africa. So and she creates a little storm, and suddenly she hears somebody, "What are you doing? Leave us alone." Ow, a voice crying out in pain. "I must go, friends. I may be needed elsewhere." And of course, it's these punks here who are attacking this elderly couple. And the Storm says, "I suggest you leave these people alone, or you will answer to me." I told you she's a badass. And so this guy takes out a knife here, And she's like, "Oh, really?" Once he takes out the knife, and then she handles them without even using her powers. And so all three of them now take out their knives, and this guy's like, "Cut her," and she handles them, and like I said, without the use of her powers or anything here. So it's a bit of the excitement, but finally she ends up does using her powers here, and asks if there's anything to help, and she's like, "You've done more than enough, thank you. We don't want to be in any more trouble. We'd best keep ourselves going." Of course, they're terrified of her powers here. So and then she gets Professor X on her mind, telling her to please return to the X Mansion here. And so Kitty says, "Doug's a good friend. I don't want him falling into the clutches of the Hellfire Club. He wants someone with him for the interview who knows the Massachusetts Academy and whose judgment he trusts. I'm flattered he asked me to go. I believe the risk is minimal," she continues here. Kitty's talking. The club's in disarray. Its effective membership reduced to Sebastian Shaw and Emma Frost, and so far as we know, she's still in a coma. If Professor Xavier monitors me telepathically, he'll know the instant I run into trouble, and you guys can act accordingly. Even Shaw isn't crazy enough to tackle the entire X-Men single-handedly. If I behave myself and not give the Hellfire Club any reason to take action, I should be okay. Of course, we know that the X-Men are going to be in Battle World, so uh, she will be running into trouble, but she's going to have to handle it on her own, which is what we're going to cover in the New Mutants. So, um, and so Xavier says, "I wonder why the Academy is so interested in young Douglas. Could they know he's a mutant?" And Kitty's like, "What?" And Professor X says, "His gift is languages, both human and computer, not as demonstrative a talent as mind reading or phasing, but legitimate nonetheless. Your opinion, Storm." And she says, "I do not like the idea of walking into the enemy camp by herself, but her plan covers every contingency. With reservation, I approve." And so does the professor here. So, um, of course, Kitty didn't know that Doug was a mutant here. And then the Professor X doesn't want Douglas to know, so she's not going to tell him. And so she comments about how breezy it is. And so she's grabbed by Storm here. Of course, it tells you see New Mutants 14, which we will be covering. We will be covering 3 consecutive issues of the New Mutants again while the X-Men are in Battle World. And so it's a win, and she goes, Orodo cut it out and says, "It's past time we had the talk, kitten. Far from prying eyes." Well, it's cold up there, and it's winter. Goodness gracious. At least let her somewhere. And so he says, "You could have asked. You didn't have to be such a show off. The Storm you prefer would not have done so, correct?" "That's right. So for your peace of mind, I must force myself to be something I am not," she says. And so basically, Storm and Kitty are sort of going to have it out, not in a fight. They're just sort of going to be talking. So basically, she's saying it's for better or for worse. She had to make that change when she became leader. It forced her to do things for the greater good, sacrifice the lives of those she loved. It just love these vertical panels here. And should the need arise, match Wolverine's ruthlessness. He sounds, Kitty says, "You sound proud of that." He says, "Merely stating a fact here." She says she's been feeling this way for a while, but she lacked the courage to make the change and decided not anymore. So, and then she went to Japan where she met Yukio. And since then, if you remember, during that era, that's where all this happened during the when the X-Men were in Japan. So, and so she basically tells Kitty, "You're gonna have to get over this." Kitty says some things shouldn't change, some things should be constant. It's bad enough that her parents couldn't keep the promise they made each other, but I thought I could count on you. And so, you know, Unfortunately, change is a part of life, and this is just me, you can't expect people to not change here. And so essentially, she's free, she's, all the stuff about but anyway, toward the end, they resolve, and she says, we gotta love each other, and so she agrees, and so, Kitty still thinks she's destroying herself, but of course she's not. And the two of them cry and hug it out. So, all right, so they're gonna go now and say goodbye. They're gonna go into the airplane here, and so Kitty's crying, and Doug notices. He says, "Don't be stupid, just something in my eye." And we're gonna see here that they're sitting on the airplane, and what she sees, um, she recognizes the voice and sees Emma Frost. She is no longer in a coma. She goes, "How nice to see you again, Catherine. I've looked so forward to our reunion. I'm ever so glad you decided to accompany Douglas. I've taken the utmost care to ensure that your stay with me is quite unforgettable." So, and she says, "Professor Xavier, help." But um we are now going into the last page here. Why did we leave the airport so suddenly, Professor? Why do we have to come to Central Park? That storm is what I hope to discover, says Professor. And so he talks about those psychic encounters that he's had, and they're leading him here, and sees this thing here, and they're gonna go inside. Thus, they're going to go through, and they disappear, which of course leads to Secret Wars. So, before we go here to the next issue of X-Men, we will again go into the New Mutants for 3 issues. So, alrighty, Uncanny X-Men 180 by Chris Claremont, John Romita Jr. With inkers Dan Green and Bob Wyacek. Like and subscribe. I do thank you for listening. Goodbye.